All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to this last in our four-part series on things Jesus never said. And today, I am very excited and honored to welcome to St. Martin's an old friend and mentor, the Reverend Canon Dr. Victor Lee Austin. There are many things that I am trying to do here at St. Martin's that I got the idea from him when I was 21 or 22, however old I was, in New York, when he did what I'm doing at St. Thomas Fifth Avenue in New York City. So the book club, that is not my idea, that is his idea, I just copied it. By the way, there is a book club this month, and I would love to have you. We're reading Christianity and Democracy by Jacques Maritain. It is very topical for the season, as election season is coming up, and I would love to have you join us for that. We would also love to have you join us for the next several weeks, as we are going to be diving into the Old Testament prophets. Not all of them. I've neglected Obadiah and so on, but I've tried to do a lot of Old Testament prophets to see how the prophets give us hope, a message of hope for hard times, possibly like the hard times that we are going through. So I hope you can come back for the next several weeks as we dig into the prophets. But today, Dr. Austin is going to give us a look at the common phrase, everything happens for a reason. Dr. Austin is the author of many books, Christian Ethics, A Guide for the Perplexed, a little book called Up with Authority, and also this book here, Losing Susan, Brain Disease, the Priest's Wife, and the God Who Gives and Takes Away. He's going to be drawing from this book for today's talk. And if you want more, I really highly recommend the book. We have copies available in the bookstore, and if they run out, he brought extra copies, and he signed the ones in the bookstore, and he'd be glad to sign the extra ones that he brought as well. I really recommend it if this talk speaks to you today. Dr. Austin is presently theologian in residence and in the Episcopal Diocese of Dallas, from whence I most recently came, and also a theologian in residence at St. Matthew's Cathedral. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Austin.
Thank you, Father. Thank you very much. I'm on. Yes, great. It is a great pleasure to be here. I thank you, Dr. Hilden, and thanks to so many staff people, including, I would add, your irrepressible podcast guys. So many people have made this enjoyable visit for me. Being here is something of an excitement for me also. When I was at St. Thomas in New York City, our rector, there was a sort of a season that he was extolling to anyone who would listen, your construction of a Gothic church in Houston. Gothic not being a word associated by New Yorkers with Texas. Father Mead, the rector at St. Thomas, liked to say that his favorite century was the 13th, in which you had both Thomas Aquinas and Dante Alighieri, and he would aver that they, Aquinas and Dante, are the foundations of Gothic, and go on to say that it is the only architecture that is, quote, of, by, and for Christendom. So that's the man I worked for. And so being here this morning is, I feel like, in a sense, I've arrived. The 9 o'clock liturgy was wonderful. Father Sindara, also old friend, Mother Cox, was nice too. It's just a lovely liturgy to be there, and what a space. Now, a bit of my story is probably good to lead into this question of everything happening for a reason. My wife died a week before Christmas in 2012. She's the Susan of the title of that book. She was 57 years old. We had met at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, We married right after college. We had 2 children, one before going to seminary and one during. Seminary was general in New York City, and after that we lived in the Hudson Valley for about 20 years, where I was curate in one church and then rector in another. Then we lived in Pennsylvania for a year and a half, where I was an assistant professor at a small college. And then we came back to New York City. That was to St. Thomas. And while we were at St. Thomas, it was that she died. All told, we were married 34 years. 15 years into our marriage, Susan's brain tumor was found. She lived another 19 years after that, and she died of brain disease, not brain cancer. The cancer never came back. The treatments were successful, but the treatments also damaged her brain and set it on a slow decline. For those of you who like this sort of thing, the cancer was an astrocytoma, and what developed afterwards was called, or at least my understanding is this is what it's called, white matter disease. But the bottom line is that eventually her brain just wasn't able to keep her body functioning. Father Mead encouraged me to write about this, mentioning as a point of reference A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. I thought the comparison crazy. Yours truly is no C.S. Lewis. But I became convinced that there was something I could say that might help other people, and thus, a few years after she died, we had the book. In Losing Susan, I try to go deep and be honest, not for my own sake, but for the readers. I wanted to bear witness as honestly as I could to what had happened, and to try as honestly as I could to understand what had happened in the light of the things I most believe as a priest. I could imagine a reader saying, "You professional religious guys, you're always telling us things when we go through hard times. What is it like for you when it happens to you? What do you tell yourself?" My prayer and hope was that truthful witness bearing to particular human facts of love and suffering and care and death would speak to people like you in your actual life. And it is in living through all this and seeing it in Susan and being a priest who has been given those special windows that people like you give people like me from time to time, special windows into the hard things of everyday life, that I've come to have views on this question of whether everything happens for a reason. I do not think so. Or to be more precise, I do not think it helpful to be looking in every case for the reasons why something has happened. Of course, sometimes we should try to figure out the reason something happened. If a bridge collapses, and if we can figure out why it collapsed, we might be able to prevent future collapses of similar bridges. So it can be helpful sometimes to figure out a connection between what has happened and what was behind it, what was before that caused it to happen. We might figure out a connection between certain behaviors and cancer, sun exposure perhaps, or smoking, you know the list. And to find out these connections, well, it seems worth knowing. But this is different. The claim of this sentence is different. Jesus asked, rhetorically, why a tower fell and whether the people who were killed in its fall were sinners. Jesus rejects that way of thinking. He refuses to engage in that kind of question. When people say everything happens for a reason, they usually mean that there is an outcome that explains why the bad thing happened. Not a reason antecedent to the event, but there's an outcome that explains why the bad thing happened. They don't mean there are reasons the cancer developed in this particular person. They mean there is something in the outcome of the cancer which explains why a good God, a just God, allowed it to occur. In my view, this sort of question is not worth pursuing. But we can say more about this. Start with a pattern of God's action with us, a pattern we see both in the scriptures and in general human experience. The subtitle of the book is, or identifies God as the God who gives and takes away. First, we have to say God gives. God is the creator. He's the reason everything exists that exists. God does not have to create. There's no theological claim that creation is necessary. There's nothing about being a God that says you got to go around creating universes. But our God is a creator. He is a giver. So everything that exists comes from him. Ultimately, it's his responsibility. He created the universe that we know, and if there are other universes, he created them too. He created life on this planet, and if there's life on other planets, he created that life also. To create does not mean to start. It can include starting. And we think that because the Bible begins in the beginning, God created. But to create in its real sense is to hold into being, hold in existence for as long as anything exists, to give it existence. Sometimes we use the word sustain for this, but it's just part of what creating means. The reason we don't want to say beginning is because time is one of those things created. So it's a creature just as, it's a created thing just as much as the things that are in time are created things. God is not himself in time. So God's creating is just God's giving. That you are still in existence now as well as a minute ago is that God is giving you this existence. So God is continually holding in existence everything that exists. And then to be a little bit more specific about this God who gives, the human beings that he creates, that he holds in existence, are creatures that have hearts. Now, heart is a very important word in the Bible. Jesus diagnoses our problem as having a hard heart. In these prophets that you'll be hearing from coming weeks, they talk about hearts of stone that one day God's going to replace with hearts of flesh. This is Jeremiah, Ezekiel in particular, probably other places that I'm not remembering. But the heart in the Psalms is really lovely too. The heart is like the core of your being. The heart it's not an organ. It's what you are really all about. And in the Psalms, there are 4 places where God is spoken of as giving you, or giving one's heart's desire. He will grant your heart's desire. So I fell in love with Susan. I wanted Susan to love me. I wanted her to marry me. And God gave me my heart's desire. It was only some time later that I realized that this language applied to it. But I just want to read you a little bit here about heart's desire. Because if I tell it without looking at this, I may tell you lies and get this straight. By the way, the phrase heart's desire is traditional to the prayer book. It goes back to 1549, occurring 4 times in the Psalms, and 4 times in the 79 book. And it's what I think is a marvelous revision of the Psalter. Proudly, I say it's the best Psalter, best contemporary Psalter in English-speaking world. So in Psalm 10, we find the words heart's desire spoken of the wicked. And the wicked boast of their heart's desire. So it's sort of proclaiming that they've got, in effect, proclaiming that they've got bad hearts. But God will not let the wicked prevail. In Psalm 20, this is the second occurrence, you have this is how it opens. May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. The name of the God of Jacob defend you, send you help from his holy place, and strengthen you out of Zion. Remember all your offerings and accept your burnt sacrifice. Grant you your heart's desire and prosper all your plans. It's part of a picture of flourishing, of being fulfilled, that God defended in trouble, and then we flourish, and that he accepts our praise and prospers all our plans, granting us our heart's desire. The next psalm is spoken of David. This is 21, and it says of that the king's heart's desire has been given. You have given him his heart's desire. And then sort of as a culmination of all this is Psalm 37. Do not, this again, the beginning, do not fret yourself because of evildoers. Now, just notice, if you're saying this out loud, as I just said it, do not fret yourself. That's like me speaking to you. But the real speaker of this psalm is God. And the real hearer of the psalm is us. So when we say the psalm, we are speaking God's words to us. It's a wonderful sort of circling thing going on there. Do not fret yourself because of evildoers. Do not be jealous of those who do wrong, for they shall soon wither like the grass, and like the green grass fade away. Put your trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and feed on its riches. Take delight in the Lord, and he shall give you your heart's desire. So that's the promise. God gives to those who trust him what their hearts most desire. But what I did not know at that time is that God will also take away what he gives. And that's something we should not shy from saying, not be afraid it's impious or impious. The Psalm 38 has something about this. Like a moth, you eat away all that is dear to us. And Psalm 39, some more. God does not only give, he also takes away. We get older, things wear out, friends move away, disease attacks the brain, making it impossible for the person to communicate with us. Now, sometimes people say when someone they love has had dementia or something like that, she no longer knows who I am. She no longer recognizes me. She no longer likes me. She no longer, all those kinds of things that happen. But I think it's better to say that she's no longer able to show those things. That something's wrong with the brain, so there's a kind of, but the brain is not you. The brain is part of you. It's part of your body, but it's not your soul. Right? And so the inability of the brain to hold things together, or whatever, does not take away the person. The person is still there. That's what I wanted to say. The person is still there. And a couple of times I experienced this with Susan when she was in a sort of coma or whatever. It's like I knew she was there because her body was there, and I could touch her body. I could, her body was there. The body is the sacrament of presence. But it can be that these things, we lose these things, these ability to communicate or to be communicated with, or to be recognized, to be responded to. And ultimately, of course, someone that we love can die. And ultimately, very ultimately, in our own perspective, we ourselves die. God gives, God takes away. It's the, it's just kind of, I don't know what to say. That's the God who's on offer. It's the God who gives and takes away. So he's given you all this, all that you have in life, and you come to church and you give some of it to him. I had no idea this would be Stewardship Sunday for you when I was writing this. Not a planned attack or something here. But, in the ancient church, they say, at least in some places in the ancient church, this was true. Everyone would bring a little bread and a little wine to church. And at the offertory, the deacons would go around and they'd collect the bread into some basket. You'd put in yours as it went around. And then they'd go around with a bucket and you'd pour your wine into the bucket. As my liturgics professor was telling us this, he said, it was all local wine. Don't worry about it turning green or foaming. Basically, everybody had their own, but you're pouring it in. Some of that would be placed on the altar, and the rest would be reserved for the poor, for those who had needs. Placed on the altar, they would be prayed over. So they're given to us by God, and we turn them over to God. And then with regard to the bread, God breaks it. God breaks our gifts. They represent us. The bread and the wine, whatever we give in the offertory, it represents us. We get placed on the altar. We get broken. When this happens, not in symbolic action, but in real life, it is about as hard as anything can be, as some of you probably know. And the giving and the taking, the breaking can come unexpectedly. I could speak about this in terms of the discovery of Susan's tumor. Suddenly you're just thrown into the midst of this immense medical, technological, complex system. And you're trying to find your way within it, and one can be quite at a loss with all this. You're in the midst of it, you don't know what to do. And then you can be in the midst, as the years go on, not knowing what to do with regard to how you care for someone. My wife always loved reading. She loved children's books. She loved Dickens. She loved reading again books she'd read before. But as the years passed after her surgery and her brain was sort of breaking down, she also loved sleeping. So she'd take a book with her to bed after lunch and sleep away. And I would wonder, does she need to be roused to activity, or does she need those extra hours of sleep? Should I push her? Is it good for her to be pushed, nudged, encouraged to be active, or is it good for her to be sleeping? I called this the epistemic bind. That is, it's a bind with regard to what we know. This is I've heard, and since then I've heard it from other people that they just don't know what, They thought such and such, but in reality they learned later, that kind of thing. We often have to act without knowing whether what we're doing is the right thing or not. So I erred on the side of pushing, but it was dreadful. I never had any confidence about how much I should push or encourage her, and how much I should step back and just let her be. Now, there's also moral importance to our realizing that God gives us things, but the things he gives us, he will take away. Moral importance, that we keep this in mind. I'll read you a slightly longer passage which comes about 2 months before the end of her life. We had been to Arizona, where our son and his wife lived, and Susan had seen her 2 grandchildren, 2 at the time. And we had come back. It had been a really great trip. And shortly after we came back, she had a fall, and in that fall, she hit her head against a closed door. And then she was just sort of out of it. So the doctor said, you should go have her checked out. Called an ambulance, actually, went to an emergency room. They didn't see anything. She was released after a couple of days. Then she was getting some therapy at home. And there was, and we'd seen the neurologist, and the neurologist said, he did, we should do an MRI. They had not done an MRI at this hospital. So we should do an MRI, and he was very calm about it, but I overheard him say to the scheduler, ASAP. So a few days later, it's the day of the MRI. This day began with physical therapy at home. Susan was tired from that, and the friend who was with her that morning told me, when I came home shortly after noon, that they had eaten an early lunch and Susan had gone down for her nap. I woke her up later, and we got into a cab to go to the hospital where the MRI equipment was. Susan was moving slowly. We had a 4:00 appointment. I was afraid we'd be late. Can't you walk a little faster? I was cross. We checked in for the appointment and then sat down to wait. Rather, I sat down. Susan was just being slow, and I thought that if I left her at the desk, she would see her way to come sit by me. She finally did. They were running very much behind schedule. Susan kept falling asleep in the chair in an uncomfortable posture, leaning over herself. Around 5:00, I told the clerk my wife was exceedingly tired and asked if she might lie down somewhere while we waited. They were accommodating and put her on a stretcher in a back room. At last, she was taken for the MRI. Afterwards, with Susan reclining on that stretcher, we had to wait for the neurosurgeon intern to come and reprogram her shunt. She had a shunt that would be potentially messed up by the MRI magnetism. When that was finally over, I sat beside Susan, holding her. She was hardly responding to anything. The stretcher lost its balance. We ended up on the floor. Someone came in and helped us get up, and then a nurse came to check Susan. There seemed to be no harm, just this strangeness that she wasn't being responsive. Since it was now 8 p.m, we really wanted to go home. They offered us a wheelchair to take to the street for the taxi. I had Susan in the wheelchair. We were crossing the largely empty lobby of the hospital. It occurred to me that her problems with slowness might have to do with lack of food. But the Argo tea shop, where we could have gotten a salad or a muffin, was now closed. I got a package of peanut M&Ms from a vending machine. I gave Susan a couple. I don't remember if she put them in her mouth or if I did. She smiled at me. I was sitting in a chair facing her in her wheelchair. "You have M&Ms in your mouth," I said. She smiled. "Don't you want to swallow them?" I said. She smiled. It dawned on me that on the other side of this hospital complex there was an emergency room. I hated the thought of not going home, but it seemed prudent at least to call Susan's neurologist before we left. The attending doctor called me back in just a few minutes. Grasping the essential ambiguity of the situation, he said we could either go home or go to the ER to have her checked out. The epistemic bind. I chose the ER. It was 9:00. A crowded New York scene. Susan on a bed with curtains separating her from others, with hardly room to stand on either side. Many people checked her various bodily signs. She was still looking with her eyes, but her head was turned to one side only. If I stood on the other side of the bed, she would not turn to me. If I was on the side of the bed she was looking at, she seemed to see me. About midnight, she was admitted to a room on the neurological floor, and I went home. That was the last day she ever spoke to me, the last day she squeezed my hand, the last day she sat beside me, the last day I sat beside her with my arm around her shoulders, the last day she put weight on her feet, the last day she put food in her mouth. I will not hide my shame or my regret. It was the last day I was ever cross with her. It is such a trite observation, you never know which day will be the last day. Yet even though trite, it is true. And it would be nearly 2 months still before I would realize that in all those ways, for all those quotidian things, this was the last day. So it's the moral importance of realizing how suddenly these things can go. Now, I had fun with teasing my reader in this book a little bit. If you read the table of contents, you'll find a little section that says the second best book of the Bible, but it doesn't tell you which one. And then later on, it has a section called the best book of the Bible. I'm going to tell you which one that is, and I still think this is true. The best book of the Bible is the book of Job. So you know the framing of it. If you've forgotten, actually, the first reading, not read today, but printed in that booklet, is from the opening of Job. The framing is that Job has everything. He's a prosperous man. He has a lot of respect in his community. He's kind of a local judge, maybe, if we read it between the lines there. And then on one day, he loses it all. He loses his animals, his crops, his children all die. 7 sons and 3 daughters. So that's the beginning. At the end of the book, Job is given back his cattle, his farm, and he's given back children. We have to kind of move quickly over the fact that these are different children than the ones at the beginning. But he ends up with 7 sons and 3 daughters. And at the end of the book, the daughters are named. The sons are not named, beginning or end of the book. And the beginning of the book, the daughters are not named. But at the end of the book, the daughters are named. And they're given names that sort of suggest female beauty. Names like eyeshadow or something. I don't know. I mean, it's Hebrew, but mascara. These are the names of the 3 daughters. And Job gives them an inheritance along with his sons. It's the only place in the Old Testament that daughters inherit along with and equally with sons. It's at the end of the book of Job. There are a couple of cases in Deuteronomy where some daughters inherit, but that's because the sons have died, and it's about keeping the land in the tribe. This is really striking about Job, that it ends there. And it suggests that there's something really important that Job learns that's not stated, but results in this change in his activity. Also, I am increasingly persuaded Job is where we find the best example of friendship in the Old Testament. Not in the stories of David and Jonathan, but in Job. Job's 3 who come to him, they're called friends. Those Job's 3 friends, when they hear about his calamities, they arrange to get together and go to be with him. This is in chapter 2. Beyond what would have been read today. They intend to be with him and to comfort, which is to say to strengthen him. In the word comfort, there's fort, strength. There's a fort in comfort. So they intend to be with him and to comfort, that is to strengthen him. But when they get there and they see the extent of his affliction, there's nothing they can do but sit there beside Job. They sit with him for a whole week. And no one says a word. Finally, Job speaks. It is Job who breaks the silence. And thereupon, Job's friends enter into disputes with him, the part of the book that we all remember the most, because it goes on and on. But we also know that real friends are people who understand us sometimes better than we understand ourselves. And so sometimes friends do dispute. Sometimes a good friend might say to me, "You are wrong, Victor, about this." Right? So it's not a mark of a failure of friendship that they dispute with Job. No mark against, let's name them, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, that they challenged Job. The mark against them is, as God says at the end, that they were wrong. Yet even though wrong, there's this: they stuck with Job. They did not leave him. They never go away. And Job is also a rich book. If you're ever in a situation where you feel like asking God, "Why am I going on living in such a wretched state as I am?" Then we can find, in those sorts of situations, one can find lines in Job that speak. Job asks God, why doesn't he turn away his gaze, leave him alone, and let him, Job, go out of existence? Why are you holding me in being, God? Why don't you just let me go? Job. Although Job asks God why he allows him to continue in existence, Job does not himself bring his life to an end. We may not see any meaning in a particular case of suffering, but it's not our role to bestow or create or perhaps even identify meaning. We just have the lives to live. God's job is to give meaning to our lives, not just to give it and take it away, but to give it back. And when he gives it back, when we hear God tell us what our lives have meant, many of us are going to be surprised. Oh, that's what my life was about? Our job is very humble. It's to stick with one another as friends. Where did Job's friends go wrong? When they tried to give meaning to Job's suffering. They tried to give the reason for those calamities that had befallen Job. That is to say, in the Bible, the people who say everything happens for a reason are Job's friends. And they were wrong. We have God's word for it. They were good friends. As I said, a lot of good things about these Job, but they were wrong to try to give a reason for what was happening to Job. So this is God's word. It's in chapter 42 to Job's friends. You have not spoken rightly about me, God says to them, as Job has. What is it then that Job says rightly about God that his friends did not? I think it is when Job is talking about wanting to speak with God, demanding to have God's ear. And he gets that speech. He gets to speak with God. Chapters 38 through 41. Mostly God speaks. Mostly God shows him stuff. But he hears God address him. And this makes possible Job's transformed understanding of the importance of each of us. And it makes possible communion in the midst of the sufferings of the world. At the end of the book, most beautiful scene of all, it's a cozy little scene. Job has seen the whole universe. And he goes back home, and his friends are there. His family is there. His neighbors are there. They bring him gifts. And, quote, they comforted Job. That word that the friends wanted to do at the beginning, it's at the end. They comforted Job over the evils that the Lord brought upon him. So it's only partly true to call them evils, but we don't need to shy away from that language. Job, we could say, he wants understanding. By wanting to talk to God face to face, he wants to understand what his own life means, why his own life has had the shape it has. In the end, he is given that understanding, not in words, but in an encounter with God, in which God does talk to him and opens his eyes to the awesomeness of the whole of creation. Creation is big. It's beautiful. It is magnificently varied. And Job sees that creation as a whole is not safe for man or woman. It is as a whole not made with us in mind. It's big. So here you have it. You've got everything you want in the book of Job. Friends, suffering, longing, communion with God, communion with other people. And I think somehow in that combination of things, this book points to Jesus. Points us to communion, because Jesus is communion with one another and with God. So while I think it is false to say that everything happens for a reason, I think it is true to say, from that picture at the end, that picture of communion, that everything that happens provides a context for human communion in the end and in the meantime with one another. I keep snapping. I don't know what I'm doing. But I think there are 2 or 3 minutes left. If there's a question or two, I'd be happy to entertain it. Do you have one, Father? It turned sort of homiletic there at the end. It's yes, great.
One of the things I've always noticed about Job is the very thing Job feared happened to him. And, we're told not to fear in the Bible, and yet the very things that Job feared happened to him. That was J. Barney McGee when I heard him years ago. He said that.
Yes. Yeah. What fear can mean different things. The question's about fear and Job and having fear, and fear. The best sense of fear in the Bible is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that I think is something. Is not to be afraid that God's going to harm me. Although I've just said that He does intend, but it's a fear that God will. The fear of God is a recognition of his untamableness. It's kind of like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Lucy asks, "Is Aslan safe?" And they say, "Oh, he's not safe. He's good, but he's not safe." That's kind of, I think, what the right kind of fear to have. Yeah. One more, or we're set. All right. Thank you, Father, for the fear.
Thank you, Victor. Let's give him.
Yeah. Did I say I forget if I said, but I don't have to go to church. I've already been. So if anyone wants to stay and talk, I'm here.